Hi everyone, welcome. Today my guest is Justin Vacula. Vacula? Did I say it right?
You got it.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. And why don't you tell us about your website and your podcast and anything else you want us to know?
Sure. So I have two major projects right now. The one that will be most relevant to the discussion today, you can find my Stoic Solutions podcast at stoicsolutions.com. And I also have the Hurdy-Gurdy Travel podcast talking about traveling the world at next to no cost, saving money and making money with credit card rewards, deals, and loyalty programs.
Very good. And my sister heard our recent interview together on your Stoic Solutions, and she wants to listen to your travel podcast. She thought it's
All right, excellent,
yeah.
excellent. I just released a new episode yesterday. More to come.
Maybe you'll garner some new listeners from our recent interview. But yeah, and I just to give some background for those of you listening, I had gone on Justin's podcast recently, and now he's reciprocating by coming on my channel. And I was looking at some of the recent podcasts that he had out, and he had a recent guest on that sort of was the impetus for me wanting to do this video. So today what we're going to talk about is changing your belief system or belief systems. And so I'm doing a series of videos about the Socratic Method, which is basically a way of working together to discover the truth. It's also a way of thinking that helps you to become more open-minded and less afraid of being wrong. And when I listened to your recent interview, you'll have to fill in the name of the person. But the guy had been someone who was, I guess you could say, on the radical left. I hate using the terms left and right. They're so arbitrary, but if you want anyone to sort of understand you colloquially, you have to use those terms. I hate that. But yeah, he'd been on the radical left, so let's just say that. And he said that he had so much trouble leaving that belief system even when he became a victim of it himself, so to speak.
Right.
And so that gave me the idea, to talk about sort of changing one's belief systems and, how hard that can actually be to do. And yeah, because I guess once we become convinced of something, it's kind of like a religion in the way that our brain operates, right? There's confirmation bias, which is like a cognitive bias that we all have. And basically anybody can suffer from this, even scientists. Like there was a study done and it said basically half of the scientists' hypothesis turned out to be the opposite, and whenever that would happen, they would dismiss it as an anomaly, or even if they replicated that outcome more than once, they would choose not to follow up on it, which I think is really kind of disturbing. I don't know, but yeah, so it just shows how prone we all are to sort of clinging to sort of our beliefs once we form them, and doing the Socratic Method is really valuable for this because it helps you to sort of not dogmatically cling to beliefs and to sort of get into the habit of questioning your own beliefs. Socrates thought that opinions are like pots. Some hold water and some don't. And so if we can get into the habit of doing that, it helps with our critical thinking. And Socrates also thought that we are sort of, to achieve excellence, we should be on a continuous journey of self-improvement. And one of the things that is essential for that is the acquisition of knowledge. But as I mentioned, our tendency seems to be to fixate on certain positions. And this is also true just for our own survival, just to save time. We learn things about the world, about the sort of underlying structure of the world, how things work. It helps us recognize patterns, understand whether a situation is safe. So from an evolutionary perspective, it kind of really makes sense that we tend to sort of cling to, belief systems. That's helpful for our functioning in some ways, but in other ways, it actually can be detrimental, at least when it comes to sort of higher order thinking. But so in order to be reasonable, we sort of have to be open to new information from a Socratic perspective. Socrates felt that we are more ignorant than not. So to achieve excellence, we can't be just satisfied with what we already know. We have to be striving to gain knowledge to get closer to the truth.
Right.
If we can get... Yeah, so basically when we hear something that conflicts with our held belief, we often experience what is known as cognitive dissonance, and that can be very uncomfortable for us. And we tend to sort of cling to our beliefs as a part of ourselves, right? But this is a problem because the best answers to various questions often change over time in light of new information or, the evolution of our beliefs, or better information can come to our attention. So if we can sort of separate our beliefs from our identity, and think with a little bit more distance, that can help us to sort of expand our horizons. I call that like thinking with a degree of detachment or distance. And that is actually more Socratic, and that helps us to become like less intellectually handicapped. So that's what we're going to talk today. And so let's turn to you, Justin. Why do you think it feels like a threat to us when our beliefs are questioned?
Yeah, I think that's a really good introduction. I think a lot of reasons that we might feel threatened or defensive when some of our beliefs are questioned. Some, as you alluded to, have a great deal of emotional investment, a great deal of time investment, all kinds of commitments that they've already made. And if there's some disagreement, there's an implication of someone saying, you're wrong about this.
Yeah.
And there's focusing on the person rather than the idea. So rather than having this detachment that you allude to, people think, oh, this is my idea. This is what I think. And you're saying I'm wrong rather than discussing the idea. And sometimes, especially on social media where we don't have nuance, many times we don't have person-to-person discussion. We can't read other people. We're not seeing what their gestures might look like, what they're thinking. We're assuming the worst in some cases. So there's some problem there. I think a second thing is that we often try to create camps of people who are with us and against us. That if you disagree, that you're this bad person. As we see, J.K. Rowling is under tremendous fire now. People are calling her transphobic and all of these personal attacks rather than just saying, okay, here's why I disagree on your point, or here's why I agree with your point. And further things people are saying, like, because of your ideas, I won't be safe. Or sometimes we hear the ideas, and in the case of J.K. Rowling, people are saying that speech is violence. And certain ideas that people put out there might lead to harm. So we need to stifle this. This person should be canceled. It's really murky, and in many ways, I think it's getting worse.
It is getting worse. It is getting worse. Well, I'm sure
that's just one example. I've just been seeing, and now you have social media, people dogpiling. It's like, look, this person said something, and you need to go and righteously crusade against her. In many cases. So it's really tough. So we can form these tribes, we can form these identities rather than having this detachment. Whereas there are a lot of people I disagree with on a lot of issues, but I can't imagine just writing people off completely and being so glib and uncharitable about it and engaging in name calling.
Absolutely, yeah. And my guest that I had on last time, Max, he's going to come on again. He's sort of an expert in Socratic dialogue. He doesn't like me to say that, but he is. But he was saying something very similar to that. Basically, you want to be charitable to other people in your conversation, sort of about issues like that, to draw them out, and that basically if you come across as if you ask questions, it will draw them out, right? Rather than making statements. So what he said was, like, basically they feel that if you ask them, what is your view of this? Or what do you think about this? That will actually let someone sort of feel comfortable enough with you that you may actually, he didn't explicitly say this, but they actually may be more comfortable changing their mind, or they may be more comfortable thinking about the other side, if you don't approach somebody like that to begin with.
Sure, they're less in the hot seat, and people like talking about themselves and their ideas. This was something mentioned in a recent book I had a guest on my podcast, Dr. Peter Boghossian. He wrote a book called How to Have Impossible Conversations with Dr. James Lindsay. So he was talking about ask a person to state their view, whereas many times we just assume what others' views are without even knowing details about the person, without knowing their perspective. Because I think on any issue, you're going to have really extreme views on one end, another end, but what about more reasonable perspectives?
Yes.
Like you see this popular hashtag now or slogan, defund the police. And some people are literally calling for
Yeah.
abolishment of police, but then some, I think, good faith or better faith actors are saying, okay, let's re-examine the situation and maybe reallocate funding or reallocate resources or
Yeah.
evaluate. So for those who are just saying completely we should just demolish and look, we can have this anarchist society and of course everything's going to work out just fine. I mean, I don't think that that's going to work. It's hard for me to be super charitable to that kind of position. It's never worked before, and it would probably devolve into
Well,
chaos. But if you
what's
could try to steel man
Yeah.
the position and try to figure
Yeah.
out why they believe what they believe,
Yeah.
I think that's something helpful too.
Yeah. Well, see, one of the things that's kind of lacking in a lot of these discussions that happen politically, especially on social media, right? The first rule of Twitter is never expect a nuanced discussion, right? 'Cause that's what J.K. Rowling had said, never expect a nuanced discussion on Twitter. Because if you actually read what she wrote, it seemed very reasonable, like she was saying she had been a trans ally and she had made some, reasonable counter arguments. She didn't seem like she was attacking anyone personally. But see, that's the value of sort of the Socratic method is you're supposed to speak freely, like you're not supposed to hold back, like you're just, as long as you tell the truth, that's, valuable, even if you're wrong, even if you're found to be in contradiction or wrong. But doing sort of a Socratic dialogue and where people can be charitable to one another and the outcome is the shared goal of getting closer to the truth, right? Then it's more likely to elicit those nuances, especially if you allow sufficient time to discuss them and everything. And like there's a lot of lack of nuance in a lot of these debates. I think part of it is due to sort of things not being reported on properly, or you having to really dig to find out details that are in dispute, before even forming an opinion, to begin with. I think that's part of it. The other part of it is, well, there's probably lots of reasons, but the other part of it is sort of people's, like you say, I don't know, what, like you say, like, people sort of wanting to pigeonhole, others.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, it's easy to attack a straw man, right? To just think that this person has this repulsive view and go after that rather than actually looking into things and trying to find some common ground, to try to find some more reasonable thing. For instance, I hear a lot of debates surrounding the issue of abortion, although you don't hear much about that today. It's a lot of other issues. But are many people who are very much in the pro-life or pro-choice camp aware of the arguments on the other side of the aisle? Can you really say, oh yeah, I've had a lot of discussions with pro-life people. Oh yeah, I've had a lot of discussions with pro-choice people. But you see some of the rhetoric, it's like, oh, they just want to take women's rights away. Oh, they don't care. They just want to murder babies. And that's not a really good take on it. To try to better understand the position of people on the other side of the aisle helps you better understand your own and even argue against the other position if you continue to have your own. But over time, perhaps we'll go more toward the middle. Maybe we'll stand in the same area, but at least to have some better perspectives about the issue rather than just quick talking points or glib dismissals of the person, just painting them as an enemy or evil because they happen to disagree on an issue.
Yeah.
And people I think are often looking to win discussions rather than even have a conversation. That was something that was pointed out in Boghossian's book. And if we can go into and ask the questions, like you said, well, why is it that you believe what you believe? Can you describe the position? Just engaging in some of these things to try to better understand the person.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually really nicely brings sort of what we're talking about back to changing one's mind. Because I've actually been on both sides of the abortion issue myself. I changed my mind. As I got older, I changed my mind. And so having been on both sides, I could say I do understand what the other side thinks. And this brings it, nicely ties back into sort of what the video is really about, right? About changing your belief systems and how that comes to happen, and why it's actually a good thing, to sort of re-examine things, and become more reasonable. So is there anything that that you feel you could do or have done to become sort of more reasonable or open-minded or advance your own critical thinking? What steps have you taken to that end?
Yeah, I think it's just being open to all sorts of information rather than just listening to one or two news sources or podcasts or YouTube videos. Just go out and listen to all kinds of different perspectives. What are people saying? So rather than reading that headline, like, let's go directly hear what the person has to say, because you're saying the reporting isn't so accurate. I think one example, and I've talked about him on my Stoic Solutions podcast a lot, is Jordan Peterson, who might have been the most misrepresented person of the past few years here. It was very much highlighted in an interview he had with an interviewer, Kathy Newman. He would say something, and she would say, "So what you're saying is that," and he's like, "No, I'm not saying that at all." And this kept going on throughout the interview, and it's like, are you really here to have a discussion, or are you just going to continually misrepresent what he has to say? There have been some times where he's gone public and he's said, okay, I regret how I phrased something. I could have been more nuanced about that. And he at least has the humility and the courage to do that. But for people to just take perspectives and just wildly misconstrue what's going on is just really, really amazing. There was one time where he was talking about a concept called enforced monogamy. And people misrepresented, said like, oh, so you think women should just be slaves to the desires of men? And he's like, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. It's a cultural concept saying that there's often social shame if there isn't monogamy, if people are engaging in infidelity. That's what he was really talking about. So listening to actually what he had to say, as this is a professor who has tons and tons of lectures and videos online. And I really liked his lectures and presentations to students a lot more than the popular content that's out there and the quick sound bites. So actually going and listening to what he had to say, and then listening to people who disagree with him. Like one YouTuber, Rationality Rules, is a channel that I follow. He focuses on a lot of philosophy, and he's had some rebuttals to what Peterson has had to say in certain times, particularly with his definition of truth and what he thinks about religion and God, and that Peterson isn't as clear. It's difficult to try to put him on one position, and he says, well, I'm not even clear where I stand either. So it's a lot of talking out loud. So I think it helps to directly listen to what people have to say rather than secondhand sources.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to say, it's also helpful to define terms, right? Yeah. Like this is almost never done in the media, ever. But it should be done. Because you're talking about abstracts a lot, the certain concepts absolutely should be defined. But that's almost never done a lot of times in sort of popular, discussions. But so what other things have you done sort of to become a more critical thinker besides like actually listening to what someone has to say and trying to get an idea of where they stand rather than sort of guessing or imposing your ideas on their position?
I think it could be a practice to try to say, okay, what are some positions I have and what are the arguments against it? That if I'm going to invest so much in this particular position, well, what do the opponents have to say? That way we can better examine our own beliefs as well, rather than, oh, I was just raised in this tradition, or my parents thought this or that, or my friends believe such and such. Well, how about engaging with the people you disagree with and having those conversations and just being open to that? Whereas maybe going to different meetups, of course, after this pandemic, just going to some in-person things, listening to different content on YouTube, podcasts, whatever you have. It's a great time to have the internet and to just be available to have so much information that's out there.
Yeah. And, I'll link to, I had written something about cognitive bias, about confirmation bias, and basically one of the, as you say, sort of considering the opposite, that's actually one of the best. There was a study that showed that was one of the best ways to overcome cognitive bias, right? Or cognitive bias basically means you're predisposed to favor information that confirms your already existing beliefs, right? And the best way to get rid of that is to consider the opposite perspective. So
and not even so much political or social positions, even look for other areas where you can improve. And now with this shelter in place, I'm typically in casinos, but now that's not a thing. And the closest open casino is quite far away in Louisiana. Here, recording from Pennsylvania. But with this time, I find it a good time to study. So I've been listening to a lot of poker content, listening to podcasts, watching videos to try to improve my game. And I'm having this attitude of, okay, I'm not convinced that I know everything there is to know. Yeah. What are some other coaches have to say? So I've been listening to content from a website called Red Chip Poker. They have a pro membership, and they have tons and tons of videos and content and forums for years now. And this is a great time to reflect. So I'm engaging in some PC gaming, playing games, listening to the content, maybe solely focusing on the videos. So there were times where a coach, person in video would say something. It's like, oh, well, I hadn't considered that. Or pause the video, think of an idea, and see what they have to say. So definitely being open to other lines of thought and looking to improve. Having an attitude of humility, looking to learn more, I think it's something good.
Yeah, I would say that that's Socratic, and that always sort of seeking knowledge, and that really can define our lives and give meaning to our lives. At least for me, it has. So, what major beliefs have you given up over the course of your life?
Yeah, so religion is a big one. So I was raised in a Roman Catholic household, and I wasn't one to question it. I wasn't one to question church teachings, belief in God, really anything like that, until I had some encounter with friends who were non-religious, and they would ask me questions, and I felt that I didn't have great answers to it.
Yeah.
And when I went to undergraduate at a Catholic university, there was a presentation on campus by a philosophy department about belief in God. Is belief in God reasonable? And discussing all kinds of points of views from religious and non-religious. They had Bible study groups. They had speakers on campus. There was so much. So after going to some of these presentations, taking some philosophy classes, I come to question the beliefs that I had when I was younger, and ultimately gave up the belief.
Yeah.
And that was a big cognitive shift for me. And in some cases it was difficult because being open as a non-religious person on a religious campus, I got a decent amount of backlash for that.
Yeah.
Some social shunning, some ostracism, some nasty comments that people had made. And then engaging in community activism, there were some threats from individuals. So it was a little bit tougher, as some people who are non-religious, or even in more general, who have perspectives that might be viewed as controversial or might lead to some ostracism in whatever way, they're reluctant to come out, or reluctant to even question it to begin with.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of that now. But just to sort of tie back into what we were talking about before with changing your beliefs, I actually had the opposite sort of journey with religion, or with belief in God, at least. Not religion per se, but I grew up in a non-religious household, right? So I was sort of free to form my own beliefs. And I was an atheist for a long time, but then when I was around 20, I sort of changed my mind. And it's interesting to think about the process of how that happens. Did you have anything more to say about sort of that process before we move on?
Yeah, there was the question, how do you find meaning in life? And I get this from a lot of religious individuals, and that was something that was discussed in the philosophy course, is can you find meaning in life without belief in a God? And there was a lot of discussion about, okay, well, what is some purpose that we can take up? What kind of life can we build? Is there some value in a legacy? Should we be striving for that? And I think a lot of these questions are answered throughout many traditions, that it's not like Christianity or Catholicism has a monopoly on meaning or cultural truth, that we could look towards Stoicism, we can look toward Buddhism, we can look toward all sorts of stories. I mean, there are people who find deep value in Lord of the Rings. Indeed, inspired by Christianity in many ways. People from all cultures and all lives. So trying to find maybe that common ground of what are people looking for in life? What are the things that are important to you? I think that's a real thing to question, and finding that sense of purpose, especially now where I think it's like 3 months of being sheltered in place. It's a good thing to survey of how have you used the time? How will you use the time? We have this, I think, extra time in a way, whereas before people would say, oh, I'm so busy. Oh, I didn't get started with this. I wanted to do this, but I never got around to it. So this is a great time to reevaluate and think about what's important. and coming out of this hopefully will be in a better shape. So yeah, just asking and questioning, like, well, what are these things that are important to me? Are they really worthwhile? And what can I learn from others? And even on the question of religion, I think Jordan Peterson makes a good case for it in many ways too, where he's talking about cultural stories. He's talking about history. He's talking about what the values are that some have and what value can we find in story. I think some atheists do this. They'll just totally dismiss religion outright and saying, oh, the Bible's worthless. We shouldn't learn anything about history. I've seen some of these. It's not as common, but I see it sometimes. And I don't think that's the right approach there. And some nastiness toward religious as well. Indeed, not the most common thing. But there are people who say, like, oh, you're religious, you're stupid, this and that. And I don't think that's productive either. To try to understand what people think and just try to have a better conversation about things.
Yeah, well, that's an ad hominem. There's no reason to attack someone personally, you know, regardless of what their belief is. You know, that if you can, well, come at it from sort of a more detached position and ask questions, then you might not, you know, be met with that type of response. I don't know. I have had trouble with that in the past. I'm trying to become more Socratic, you know, and not attack people for, I mean, I don't do that now, but I do tend to get sort of passionate, or I did. Maybe I've made progress. Maybe I didn't do that as much. But I did tend to do that in the past. So I'm working on that, you know.
Yeah, and I think it can happen in all spheres as well. So it's not just religion. It's really anything that happens. Because I'm mostly vegan. I try to avoid animal products. And here at home, it's easier as I can go to the grocery store and buy products. But sometimes on the go, it's not as practical. I think that's one of the bigger challenges to it. And I see some people in animal rights groups or pages and just like, oh, meat eaters are murderers. You get some of these,
Morrissey has a Morrissey here. He has Meat is Murder, right? That's a Smiths album.
Yeah. You get some of this, and it's not really productive to our discussion. So you get groups throwing fake blood at people, or some of this over the top really language, extreme. And it's like, and that's why I say, like, well, I can be supportive of animal rights issues. I can be vegetarian, mostly vegan, but just because I say, okay, I don't like everything that PETA does or Greenpeace or whatever organization happens to be the case, it doesn't mean, okay, I'm this nasty person. And I think that could be the case in many ways. Like, just because you disagree with some elements of Black Lives Matter platform, the group, the movement, whatever the case might be, it doesn't mean that you're opposed to everything they stand for, or you're some evil, or
worse, that you're racist.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. That's funny, Justin. You know, you and I have gone the opposite ways on various things. I used to be vegetarian for I think close to 10 years. I was vegetarian, but then when I wanted to get pregnant, I decided to start eating meat again. So I've been eating meat for maybe 6 years. But for like pregnancy and nursing, I don't know, I changed. But that's so funny. We've gone.
Yeah,
we've gone the opposite way.
Yeah, and on my podcast that you talked about earlier, it was David Silverman who was the guest, and he was definitely far to the left, and he was with this idea of feminism. We should believe all women. Women never lie about sexual assault or anything else. I have to be careful of language here for YouTube, but it turned out to be the case. He argued that there were false allegations, and even when he got the false allegations, he was saying about like, oh, well, maybe I'm just collateral damage to this, and even though there are some bad actors, maybe it's not as common as we think, or it was some kind of fluke. But eventually he saw other cases of this and looked deeper into the issue and came to question it. And there are a lot like this, because I think there are just some popular ideas in society, and this like very high in the sky idea that people have about feminism. It's all about equal rights, it's empowerment of women. But then you look into it and you'll see some of the problems, some of the misleading statistics, some of the very negative attitude about men, the dismissal, even women speakers who challenge feminism, and perhaps especially so. You have people pulling fire alarms at colleges, calling threats on events, buildings, needing security to have certain events for people like Christina Hoff Sommers, who's like the mildest of the mildest
she is mild.
out there. People just questioning Kathy Young, Camille Paglia, just a lot of speakers out there. And even there was a documentary that came out, The Red Pill by Cassie J, who was herself a feminist and came to question it. And the screenings of that were under fire as well. And some women can be extremely vicious toward others, calling them gender traitors, sister punishers. I see this language so common. And if you happen to disagree with them, then, oh, you're a misogynist, you're this, you're that. White privilege, you get all these, male privilege, you get all these things that just really aren't so helpful for discussion.
Well, see, that's why we need to be more Socratic, right? Because we have to define what we've been talking about. Feminism, feminism, there's such a broad term. There's so many different types of feminism. It's how do we define it? You know what I mean? It all comes down to how we even define it to begin with. So before people shouldn't attack each other regardless. But before they start doing that, they need to figure out what they're even talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and if you're going to say it's like similar to the BLM issue that, well, are you in agreement that women should have equal rights, or are you in agreement on this or that? Like from a dictionary standpoint, like, okay, but then what are those rights? Like, what do you want? Is it equality that you want? Is it equality of outcome, equality of opportunity? What are you going to do to get there? Like with BLM, it's like, oh, we need to defund the police. We need to dismantle the police is the perspective that we're hearing sometimes. And no, I'm not on board with that. But reform, like, okay, I can be on board with that in some areas. I'm really hesitant to align with groups in many ways, because then there's this baggage of a label, and you're grouped in with all of these other people who might have these perspectives that you don't like. Sometimes I've been accused of being alt-right when I want nothing to do with identity politics or nationalism or white nationalism. I'm just not a fan of this at all. And that's what I've heard some of and from the alt-right. I'm just not a fan of it. But people is like, oh, well, you disagree on this point, so you must be on that side. Like, no, I'm not. I'm not. Like, even I use the term stoic or atheist, and I'm even hesitant in some cases to do that, because I like to say I draw inspiration from Stoicism. I suppose, yes, I could identify as a Stoic in many ways, but I think like any tradition, you're going to find some disagreement with central thinkers. And even Seneca, I believe, said that we're not to be slavish to past teachings. As you said earlier, that we make progress, we find new ideas, and we grow upon what we've learned in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah, so labels are really difficult, like talking about issues on an issue-to-issue basis and trying to understand, like gun control is another term that's quite loaded. Excuse the pun there. It's another
issue that I've changed my mind on, so I understand both sides.
Yeah, like it's a question like, are you for or against gun control? Like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Like, what kind of restrictions? Should all weapons go away, or maybe like semi-automatic or automatic, or who should hold them? It's more complex, and I think it's going to be really honest that a lot of these issues are very complex, and even an element of saying, well, I don't really know where to stand on that. I really haven't done the research, rather than just like, oh, I'm for this position, I'm against this position, but you really haven't looked much into it. Like even on the statues issue, I'll say like, I don't really know. I'm not quite sure about that. Gun control, I really don't know too much about the issue. And that's okay. I think it's great to say that.
It would be great to say that, and that would be more Socratic. Socrates says that if you admit that you don't know, you're in a better position than if you are, clinging to your ignorance, basically. And, a lot of these issues, you'll see people, you can see that they are ignorant about certain issues. That's not to say that I'm never ignorant about issues. Certainly I am, but you can see that people are ignorant about them when they make a response. And it would be better if they could be humble enough to say, well, maybe I don't know. Or at least if they're going to go out and demonstrate, that they could learn more about the issues first. Because sometimes when they speak, you can see the extent of their ignorance.
Right.
It's not to say that I wouldn't, I'm not very ignorant about certain things. But, you can see that happening a lot of the time. Or you can see sort of the lack of nuance or the unwillingness to discuss things in a nuanced way. But
right. Even on some issues that I wouldn't think were so charged. It was recently I was visiting a family member, and another family member was over. And generally I don't talk with too many family members because conversations in the past haven't been so great. And it was immediately like, oh, well, your mom said that you were doing this and that. And, oh, well, look, you're getting all these credit cards. As I mentioned, I have a podcast talking about travel. And it's like, oh, you're crazy. You're going to lose all your money. Like, well, so instead of like, oh, well, can you tell me more about this? There's just this assumption, oh, you're going to go broke. You're crazy. Like some of this loaded language from a family member, which I thought was interesting because it could have been a learning opportunity for her. But instead of that, she just completely came out with a dismissive attitude. And at that point, I wasn't even interested in a discussion.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just coming into a discussion with a more open mind and asking questions, I think, is really helpful rather than just assuming the worst about people. It's like, okay, maybe you had a bad experience with credit in the past. Maybe someone you know had a bad experience that they ran up all this debt. But no, it's not what I'm doing at all. Okay, I'll get a card. I'll pay everything off. I'm not paying unnecessary fees. I'm not spending more than I can. I'm actually a very frugal person, which I guess she wasn't aware of. So just some interesting encounters. The same thing with poker too. The assumption that, oh, you're a degenerate. Oh, you're going to lose everything. Oh, it's all luck, and they don't see a skill element to it. They don't know what goes behind it. They're just assuming that, oh, you're going to go broke. Oh, you're just a degenerate. You get this from some people too.
Yeah, well, see, this is what I want to change. I want people to change sort of their attitude about how they come at things. That's sort of why I created the whole Socratic Dialog series of videos. I'm not really sure about what the best way to go about doing that was, which is why I thought, well, let me think about the times that I've changed my mind and the process that led to that. But yes, if you're attacked on something, you probably are going to be, you're going to retrench. You're not going to change your mind. So that's an important part of it. Wish I had more answers. But so you've already sort of touched on this, but you mentioned that there were negative consequences for changing some of your beliefs, such as being attacked for them or whatever, by people who are sort of unwilling to be Socratic in their approach. But has your life changed for the better or for the worse, since changing various beliefs?
Oh, absolutely. I think any time we're closer to the truth is a better position for us. I mean, there might be some extreme examples of, okay, well, if you're harboring some people who are unfairly wanted by the law, like, okay, the Nazi knocks on your door, like, oh, do you have anyone hiding in? Like, maybe you should lie about it in that case to protect someone else, right? But for the most part, there's going to be some ups and downs. I don't think anything is totally clear that if you're going through a process of changing your ideas, that's going to be good in the long run, but there might be some short-term consequences. I think some moderation is really called for, especially with poker, for example. I started very small through just reading books, listening to podcasts, studying material online, very low money investment. I didn't start playing these games, buying in for $1,000 and, just taking this huge shot at it. I was playing penny games online, buying in for $5 and studying while I was doing it and just taking a very gradual process and learning while I was doing it as well. So I think some moderation in it and just trying to learn as you go. And maybe on a certain issue, like, okay, well, if you're experiencing some doubts about your ideas, don't just go all of a sudden and carve your identity in the opposite of what you were thinking before. That's not going to be a great idea. You have this idea of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but that's not always the case. No. Because you can find particular groups that aren't so savvy and are maybe the same side of the coin, that they're not so much interested in the truth, that they're quite destructive. Like there's an element on the far right as well, that just because I disagree with some people on the left, I don't want to just align myself with people who are just engaged in violence, who aren't being charitable, who aren't making great arguments, right? So there's that on all sides of the issue.
Well, it's more likely people who are in the middle, who aren't going to be quite as radical in their approach, I would hope. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know I guess that's not a good correlation to make. Do you think that people who are radical in their beliefs are also more likely to be radical in their approach to discussing said beliefs, or is it a failing that most people have? Or is
I think there can be a correlation there. Sure, maybe not in all cases, because well, there are the radical Buddhists, going out and engaging in violence. Like, I don't know what that might look like. There have been some acts of terrorism here and there, and that's even like difficult to get at, like what the exact motivations were in some cases. So I suppose anything could be radicalized and led to violence, or in some cases extreme pacifism For instance, maybe someone who doubts the efficacy of some medicine or has some religious tradition against it, like not giving medicine could be itself some harm. So that could be some radical implementation.
Yeah.
You could
we'd have to define radical too. I'm breaking my own rule to sort of say that without sort of defining what constitutes, radicalism to even begin with. But So say, what beliefs do you think are most important, to your sense of self that would be the hardest for you to change now? And what would it take for you to change them?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think a case of autonomy and freedom is really important to me. That, well, it's nice for me to be able to make my own choices, to have some level of independence and just questing toward knowledge. I think it would be very hard to change that idea. Maybe that's an easy one, but it's like, I'm really confident in the idea of just having that life agility, having that freedom. I think that's. I think to like, what do I spend a lot of time on? I mean, poker has been really nice to me. I couldn't see myself just quitting and completely giving up the game, because I find a lot of fun in it. I find a lot of intellectual stimulation. It's decent income for me. So I'm happy with that. I really can't see myself working in an office job and having like a cubicle and engaged in monotonous work. That just wouldn't be very fun for me. When I was more involved with the traditional workplace, there was an element of that, of being on a particular schedule, of having to do all of this paperwork, and the job demands just got more and more over time. And I eventually found myself drifting away from it. So I live a non-traditional life in many ways. I'm not that person for the 9 to 5. I just want to make income in other ways and have that sense of freedom. So I wouldn't want to give up poker. I wouldn't want to give up the podcast that I'm working on, because I find a lot of passion for stoicism, for what I'm doing with travel and credit cards and financial pursuits of mine. So it's been really interesting and opened a lot of experience. For instance, the credit card hobby has got me to Stoicon in 2019 to attend Greece, because before doing any of this, my idea was travel is going to be really expensive. So, maybe once a year, maybe just some local stuff, but then finding a way to dramatically cut the costs through credit card rewards programs and certain deals has been really great. So I find myself continuing with that hobby, and I've met a lot of friends through it as well, which was an unexpected benefit. So the things I spend most of my time on, I'm always open for change. If there's different opportunities. I've had so many positions and jobs and moved different places in the past few years. So anything's really open. But at the moment, I feel pretty committed to what I'm doing. Although better opportunities can come for all I know. So
will you be staying child free then?
Yeah, that's a commitment too. That's an interesting question. Yeah, at this time, I just don't think it would be a proper decision for me to make. I'm not going to say that like everyone out there shouldn't have kids or anything. I'm not going to take that position. I think it's a position that would vary from person to person. But the idea of thinking like, what would this entail? That how much of my time, how much of my resources is this really worth it? The idea of finding a suitable partner and having a kid, I'm just I'm just not up for that at the moment. It's just not the case. So I have really good friends. I travel. I'm pretty happy with that. Even thinking of getting a pet, that's been a common thing with the pandemic. It's not to say a pet is just like a child, but there would be an element of care. And to just say, okay, well, I'm going to have to monitor this dog or whatever the case might be. Not to mention that it might be against my lease to get a pet. But
so you have to kennel it whenever you travel.
Yeah, and that would be quite a commitment. If I would even be able to go to certain hotels, and who knows? But I plan to be on the move a lot, like I was before the pandemic. So it's just not a suitable commitment at this time. That's a lifestyle, and that even comes. I've even experienced some shaming language because of that before. I've had a guest on my podcast, Sunrise Hoodie, YouTube creator, who talks about men going their own way. That he's pledged to having a life where he is single, saying explicitly that he doesn't want relationships, he doesn't want kids, he doesn't want to be married, he Yeah, so I had him on my show and talk about his perspective, and even having him on the show got some criticism. You get the glib
Oh,
like,
sure,
oh,
yeah.
you hate women, you're afraid of commitment. That's what I've heard from some, like, oh, you're just afraid, you're not willing to take risks. And the first thing that came to my mind is like, wait, you're telling the person who's primary playing poker, and you're going to say, oh, you're not afraid of taking risks. So I thought that to be quite humorous in a way. And then the response at that time was something like, well, it's a calculated decision for you, and it's not really a risk because in the long run, you'll end up ahead. It's like, okay, well, how many people are going to take that chance? They're just not going to do it.
Yeah.
Some people will not. But it's, again, a sign that they're not being charitable to the perspective. Instead of asking that question of, okay, well, why is it that you have this position? They're just jumping to a conclusion with shaming language. And that's not a good way to go about things. The idea is taking calculated risks anyway. I mean, I could say that to someone too. It's like, oh, well, you don't want to play poker. Oh, you're just afraid. But maybe the things that you just don't feel comfortable with it. It's not,
well,
it's not your personality. It's not your skill set.
You
Yeah,
don't enjoy doing that.
I mean, you don't like playing Dungeons and Dragons. You're afraid to play. Like, come on. Maybe you like it, but I'm not gonna shame people who don't like the same things that I do. It's just not something I find myself doing.
Yeah, and this has been really interesting. I just feel that we haven't gotten enough insight into the process of how we change our minds, or why people are so willing to sort of attack others. And I feel like I haven't gotten, not that this is your fault or anything, I just don't know. I don't have an answer for why that's the case, except for, like I said in the intro, because of cognitive bias and things like that. But why is that the case? Why aren't people more reasonable? Why aren't people more Socratic?
Yeah, it might be the case that some people are just trying to preserve stability, that they have this norm, they're comfortable with the position they have now, and they just might not like change. Again, this is a speculation because I don't want to be a hypocrite here and say that, oh, because people don't want to change their minds or engage in this or question because they're afraid. I think there might be I think that might be the case for some people. And even when questioning religious ideas, I would get some responses like, well, aren't you afraid that if all people had your perspective, that everyone would just be murdering and killing and engaging in all this debauchery? It's like, well, no, I don't think that's the case. So when people say that, I have this suspicion that people think that there's going to be some social discord as a response of people changing their minds. And I think that could be one reason, that it's like people are comfortable with what they know. And when new ideas are presented, especially if it threatens some other ideas or their current station of life that they have, I mean, people have left certain groups, religious or not, and then, well, what happens with their social circles? It's like, oh, well, you married into a particular religion, and then you're going to say, oh, excuse me, that I'm coming to question it, and maybe there'll be that social ostracism. They're just comfortable with whatever. And it could be hard work too, because you're taking the time to look into ideas, you're challenging them, you're trying to learn more. And maybe some people just want to watch Netflix and not really bother with the whole thing. So I think I think some inclination toward stability, some social order. You've seen this meme Karen come out, which in the credit card community, it's interesting because Karen would usually be a customer service representative who would just give you a hard time saying like, oh, sorry, we can't do this transaction. It's cash only. You can't use a credit card or something, or, oh, it's only one per customer, or, something like that. But now it's come to be kind of this snitch in a way that this person is telling on someone else to preserve some kind of rule that people really don't think is worthwhile. So in some cases, this might parallel with the current situation, that there's some kind of social enforcement of, this is just the idea in this community. You have to stay within this box. Don't dare question what we believe. And this pitting of the us versus them, I think, just seeing people who disagree as evil, as seeing them as some nasty person, as threatening. And some people just want to squelch that. They don't want to have that opposition.
Yeah, well, it's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing. Because anybody who supports that could have their own life destroyed. Do you know what I mean? They want to be free to speak, but they just don't want you to speak freely, right?
Mm-hmm. And in some cases, yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I was listening to a discussion with Michael Shermer, who came out with a recent book, Giving the Devil His Due, and he was talking about in some cases all ideas were blasphemous. And Frederick Douglass questioning slavery, people thought that that was blasphemous. And, oh, well, we should shut him up. He shouldn't say this. He shouldn't say that. It's going to disrupt society, right? So you'll hear that in all ages.
Sure.
And, maybe some ideas can be very bad and be disruptive. But the idea, at least with Shermer, was that, okay, well, we have this public exchange, and putting people out there and having them share their ideas is overall a good thing. You're going to get some of the more fringe, as he was saying, like people who are denying the Holocaust, saying from ranges that, oh, it never happened, it was all this conspiracy, or the numbers were a little bit off, or whatever the case might be. Like, okay, you're going to have some of that, but then you could challenge it. You could say, okay, well, this is what this person believes, and here's our response to it. You're always going to have some disagreement, but to just completely say, okay, we should just ban these individuals. It could be the case that when that happens, that it actually backfires, that more people gravitate toward that line. And then they could say, aha, look, they're trying to cover up the truth, or whatever the case might be. And I think there are a lot of examples of some perhaps odious beliefs, to use that term, where people were public, and it actually led to people having public responses. Like Westboro Baptist Church would, before the pandemic, protest a lot of funerals, and you would see communities galvanize and say, okay, we don't support this, we're against these people, and at least you could see what they think, that it's out in the world. And challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I guess the idea that bad ideas will evolve out through discussion, like bad ideas will be put aside. But wouldn't you agree though that we really only had, the right to free speech has only been something that humanity has really had since the Enlightenment. So for the vast majority of history, that was true, where you couldn't really speak freely, and if you did speak freely, that you could be thrown in jail for it. So really, it's actually free speech is an anomaly. Would you agree if you look at most of history?
Oh, absolutely. It's sad to see some philosophers of centuries ago who wouldn't even put their name to certain ideas, or, okay, publish this when I die. And you find some of these after death publications. I'm losing the name for it right now.
Posthumous.
And people, posthumous, there it is. People just not having that freedom in a way. I mean, there are certainly consequences. Anyone could just do whatever, but there are going to be consequences for it, and that's what you.
Socrates himself. Look what happened.
Absolutely.
Look what happened to him. Yeah, it can be a dangerous thing.
So it's going to have some negatives, of course, but overall, Shermer puts out the idea of sunlight being the best disinfectant, and you're just going to have more cultural freedom and ideas. Like now, there's a lot of speculation as to what was going on in China surrounding the current pandemic, in that there were whistleblowers who, if they were more public about the ideas, if they weren't squelched, which seems that it might be the case, that, okay, there could have been this alert beforehand that said, like, okay, look, we're going to contain this, we're going to do better, there's a problem here. But this person wasn't able to be as public and possibly was executed or jailed, who knows what. That's one big consequence right there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has given me a lot to think about. Like I said, maybe we've gotten a little bit closer to the truth. At least I hope so.
Hopefully so. Yes. So hopefully some listeners can come out of this looking for some more fruitful discussions, looking into some ideas that they disagree with, and just being more open to information and giving themselves and others a chance.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And for anyone listening, if you like this type of content, please remember to subscribe. Click the bell icon. That'll notify you if any new videos are posted to the channel. And I also put a link in the description. You can support the channel if you like, by making a small donation. And I'll also link any, I guess I mentioned some studies and something I'd written about cognitive bias. I'll link to that as well as your website, Justin. But thank you so much. And this has been fun. And thanks so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Yeah. Feel free. Any listeners you want to connect on social media, you can find me, Justin Vacula. That's V as in Victor, ACULA. And you can find Stoic Solutions Podcast and the Hurdy-Gurdy Travel Podcast.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. Take care.